Buddhāvataṃsaka Sutra. Book 23. Ascent to the Palace of the Tushita Heaven. Video 1. Then, by the spiritual power of the Buddha, in each continent Jambu of every world in the 10 directions was seen the Buddha sitting under a tree, at each of which were enlightening beings imbued with spiritual power from the Buddha expounding the teaching, each thinking themselves to be always face to face with the Buddha. At that time the Buddha, again by spiritual power, went to the palace adorned by all exquisite jewels in the Tushita Heaven of satisfaction and happiness, yet without leaving the foot of the enlightenment tree and the palace of the Sutra Heaven on the peak of Mount Sumeru. The celestial king of the Tushita Heaven, seeing from afar the Buddha's advent, set up a jewel-mined lion seat in the palace. That lion throne was made of a collection of celestial jewels obtained from roots of goodness cultivated in the past, made manifest by the spiritual powers of all Buddhas, born of countless hundreds of thousands of millions of billions of roots of goodness, created by the pure teachings of all enlightened ones, adorned by the power of infinite virtue. Resulting from pure actions, it was indestructible, endlessly delightful to all beholders. Its transcendental qualities were not influenced by the world. Though all sentient beings come to gaze on it, none could exhaustively fathom its glories. There were 100 trillion tears all around it, with 100 trillion gold webs, 100 trillion flower curtains, 100 trillion jewel curtains, 100 trillion garland curtains, and 100 trillion incense curtains hung above it. Garlands of flowers hung down, their scent perfuming everywhere. 100 trillion canopies of flowers, 100 trillion canopies of garlands, and 100 trillion canopies of jewels were held by various celestial beings arrayed in rows on all 4 sides. 100 trillion precious robes were spread on it. 100 trillion balconies radiantly adorned it, with 100 trillion nets of pearls and 100 trillion nets of jewels covering above, while 100 trillion nets of necklaces hung down on all 4 sides. 100 trillion nets of ornaments, 100 trillion nets of canopies, 100 trillion nets of robes, and 100 trillion nets of jewel tapestries were hung above. 100 trillion nets of jewel lotuses in full bloom with glorious light, 100 trillion nets of incense with exquisite fragrance delighting everyone, 100 trillion curtains of jewel chimes moving gently producing harmonious elegant sounds, 100 trillion curtains of precious sandalwood, its fragrance perfuming the air. 100 trillion curtains of precious flowers in full bloom, 100 trillion curtains of raiment of various subtle hues, rare in the world, 100 trillion curtains showing enlightening beings, 100 trillion multicolored curtains, 100 trillion gold curtains, 100 trillion lapis lazuli curtains, and 100 trillion curtains of various jewels, were all hung above. 100 trillion curtains of all jewels, adorned by huge wish-fulfilling gems, and 100 trillion flowers of exquisite jewels surrounded in glorious arrays. 100 trillion reflecting hangings, of superb beauty, were placed at intervals. 100 trillion garlands of jewels and 100 trillion garlands of fragrances hung down on all 4 sides. 100 trillion celestial fragrant resins perfumed everywhere. 100 trillion ornaments of celestial decorations, 100 trillion ornaments of jewel flowers, 100 trillion ornaments of jewels from the finest mines, 100 trillion ornaments of wish-fulfilling jewels, and 100 trillion ornaments of wish-fulfilling pearls from the ocean, adorned the body of the throne. 100 trillion embroidered tapestries of exquisite jewels trailed down like streamers. 100 trillion cosmic nets of diamonds, 100 trillion wish-fulfilling jewels, and 100 trillion beautiful gold treasure troves were placed at intervals as embellishments. 100 trillion luminous jewels and 100 trillion sapphires blazing with light and 100 trillion indestructible celestial gems formed the windows, 100 trillion jewels of pure qualities, giving forth sublime colors, and 100 trillion jewels from pure beautiful minds formed the doorways. 100 trillion crescent jewels, finest in the world. 100 trillion mind king wish-fulfilling jewels, 100 trillion rose gold jewels, 100 trillion jewels from pure truths, and 100 trillion jewels symbolic of sovereignty, a radiating light, covered the top. 100 trillion jewels set in pure silver and 100 trillion jewels emblematic of the polar mountain adorned its lotus blossom bank. 100 trillion pearl ornaments, 100 trillion lapis lazuli ornaments, 100 trillion ruby ornaments, 100 trillion wish-fulfilling jewel ornaments, 100 trillion ornaments of jewel lights, 100 trillion ornaments of jewels of various minds, 100 trillion red pearls, extremely pleasing to the sight, 100 trillion ornaments of jewels from treasuries of boundless colors and forms, 100 trillion ornaments of incomparable jewels of extreme purity, and 100 trillion ornaments of jewels of superlative brilliance were hung all around as adornments. 100 trillion unusually beautiful decorations made of jewels, 100 trillion jewels in the exquisite forms of celestial beings, 100 trillion subtle perfumes from the 10 directions, 100 trillion black sandalwood incenses, 100 trillion fragrances from inconceivable realms, 100 trillion most excellent scents, and 100 trillion extremely pleasing incenses all emitted fragrant airs, perfuming the 10 directions. 100 trillion special incenses were scattered in all 10 directions. 100 trillion scents of pure light perfumed sentient beings. 100 trillion incenses of boundless various colors perfumed all the Buddha lands, never fading away. 100 trillion perfumes, 100 trillion scents, 100 trillion burning incenses perfumed everything. 100 trillion aloe perfumes from lotus blossom banks producing great sound. 100 trillion wafting fragrances with the power to transform the minds of sentient beings, and 100 trillion perfumes with the power to enlighten pervaded everywhere, causing all the senses of those who noticed them to become dispassionate and tranquil. There were also 100 trillion various arrays of peerless perfumes, kings among fragrances. There rained 100 trillion clouds of celestial flowers, 100 trillion clouds of celestial perfumes, 100 trillion clouds of heavenly incense powders, 100 trillion clouds of celestial blue lotuses, 100 trillion clouds of celestial red lotuses, 100 trillion clouds of heavenly white lotuses, 100 trillion clouds of heavenly mandava flowers, 100 trillion clouds of all kinds of celestial flowers, 100 trillion clouds of celestial garments, 100 trillion clouds of jewels, 100 trillion clouds of celestial canopies, 100 trillion clouds of celestial banners, 100 trillion clouds of celestial crowns, 100 trillion clouds of celestial ornaments, 100 trillion clouds of celestial garlands, 100 trillion clouds of necklaces of heavenly jewels, 100 trillion clouds of celestial sandalwood incense, and 100 trillion clouds of celestial aloe incense. There were set up 100 trillion jewel banners, there were hung 100 trillion jewel pennants, there were draped 100 trillion jewel streamers, there were lit 100 trillion incense braziers, there were spread 100 trillion jewel garlands, There were held 100 trillion jewel fans. There were taken up 100 trillion gold whisks. There were draped 100 trillion nets of jewel chimes producing exquisite sounds when stirred by the breeze. 100 trillion jewel balustrades surrounded the throne. 100 trillion jewel palm trees were arrayed in rows. 100 trillion windows framed with gorgeous gems made magnificent adornments. 100 trillion jewel trees provided shade all around. 100 trillion jewel turrets adorned north to south and east to west. 100 trillion jeweled doorways were draped with garlands. 100 trillion golden chimes produced sublime music. 100 trillion ornaments in the form of auspicious symbols were draped in splendid arrays. There were 100 trillion jewel talismans able to get rid of all evils. 100 trillion gold treasuries woven of golden thread. 100 trillion jewel umbrellas with handles of precious elements held in rows, and 100 trillion nets of all kinds of precious ornaments arrayed at intervals. 100 trillion luminous jewels radiated various kinds of light. 100 trillion light beams illumined everywhere. There were 100 trillion sun treasury orbs and 100 trillion moon treasury orbs, all made of collections of jewels of infinite colors. 100 trillion fragrant flames shone with crystal clear light. 100 trillion banks of lotuses burst into glorious bloom. 100 trillion nets of jewels, 100 trillion nets of flowers, and 100 trillion nets of incenses covered above. 100 trillion jewel robes, 100 trillion sapphire robes, 100 trillion celestial yellow robes, 100 trillion celestial red robes, 100 trillion celestial robes of unusual colors, 100 trillion extraordinary celestial robes of various precious substances, 100 trillion various perfumed robes, 100 trillion robes made of all precious substances, and 100 trillion pure white robes, were all carefully spread, delightful to all observers. 100 trillion banners of celestial chimes and 100 trillion banners of golden mesh produced subtle tones. There were 100 trillion banners of heavenly embroideries, containing all colors. 100 trillion fragrant banners were draped with webs of perfume. 100 trillion flower banners showered all kinds of flowers. 100 trillion banners of raiment trailed exquisite robes. There were 100 trillion celestial jewel banners, studded with all sorts of gems, 100 trillion celestial ornament banners, decorated with all manner of embellishments, 100 trillion celestial garland banners, garlands of various kinds of flowers arrayed on four sides, 100 trillion celestial canopy banners, with jewel bells harmoniously ringing, pleasing all hearers. There were 100 trillion celestial conches producing wonderful sounds, 100 trillion celestial bass drums producing great booms, 100 trillion celestial pipes producing subtle sounds, 100 trillion celestial drums producing loud beautiful sounds, 100 trillion orchestras playing all at once, 100 trillion independent celestial musicians producing sublime sounds filling all Buddha lands, 100 trillion celestial magical music sounding like echoes, responding to all things, 100 trillion celestial drums producing wonderful sounds when struck, 100 trillion kinds of miraculous celestial music which produced spontaneous harmony, and 100 trillion various celestial assemblies producing wonderful music extinguishing all afflictions. 100 trillion pleasing sounds sang praises of giving offerings. 100 trillion far-reaching sounds sang praises of service. 100 trillion extremely deep sounds sang praises of practical application. 100 trillion sounds of myriad subtleties sang praises of the fruits of the Buddha's deeds. 100 trillion delicate sounds sang praises of principles in accord with reality. 100 trillion unimpeded sounds of truth sang praises of Buddha's past practices. 100 trillion pure sounds sang praises of past offerings to the Buddhas. 100 trillion sounds of teaching sang praises of the supreme fearlessness of the Buddhas. 100 trillion infinite sounds sang praises of the infinity of enlightening beings' virtues. 100 trillion sounds of the stages of enlightening beings sang praises of revealing the practices appropriate to all the stages of enlightening. 100 trillion uninterrupted sounds sang praises of the endlessness of the Buddha's virtues. 100 trillion informative sounds sang praises of practices by which Buddha is seen. 100 trillion sounds of extremely profound teaching sang praises of principles corresponding to unhindered knowledge of all things. 100 trillion great sounds filled all Buddha lands. 100 trillion sounds of unimpeded purity caused all to rejoice in accord with their inclinations. 100 trillion sounds of non-dwelling in the triple world caused all hearers to enter deeply into the nature of reality. 100 trillion sounds of joy caused the minds of all hearers to be unobstructed, with deep faith and respect. 100 trillion sounds of the realm of Buddhahood revealed the meanings of all things. 100 trillion sounds of concentration formula expounded the distinctions of all doctrines, definitively comprehending the esoteric treasury of the enlightened ones. 100 trillion sounds of all truths, gentle and pleasant, harmonized all the music. There were 100 trillion newly inspired enlightening beings who, as soon as they saw this throne, doubly increased their determination for omniscience. 100 trillion enlightening beings preparing the ground, their minds pure and joyful. 100 trillion practicing enlightening beings, their understanding pure and clear. 100 trillion nobly born enlightening beings, abiding in supreme zeal. 100 trillion enlightening beings equipped with skill and means, activating the great vehicle. 100 trillion enlightening beings in the abode of right mindfulness, diligently cultivating the path of all enlightening beings. 100 trillion non-regressing enlightening beings, purifying all stages of enlightenment. 100 trillion enlightening beings of youthful nature, attaining the light of concentration of all enlightening beings. 100 trillion prince of teaching enlightening beings, entering the inconceivable sphere of all Buddhas. 100 trillion coronated enlightening beings, able to manifest the 10 powers of infinite enlightened ones. 100 trillion enlightening beings with mastery of spiritual powers. 100 trillion enlightening beings with pure understanding. 100 trillion enlightening beings with determined minds. 100 trillion enlightening beings with profound, unbreakable faith. 100 trillion enlightening beings expounding the meanings of the teachings, causing knowledge to be sure. 100 trillion enlightening beings with undisturbed correct recollection. 100 trillion enlightening beings of certain knowledge. 100 trillion enlightening beings with the power to retain what they hear, holding all the Buddha teachings. 100 trillion enlightening beings producing infinitely vast great awareness and understanding. 100 trillion enlightening beings abiding in the faculty of faith. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had attained transcendent self-control and fully kept all the moral precepts. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had attained transcendent generosity and were able to give everything. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had attained transcendent forbearance, whose minds did not wander and who were able to accept all the Buddha teachings. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had attained transcendent vigor and were capable of carrying out infinite efforts for emancipation. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had attained transcendent meditation and were imbued with the shining light of infinite meditations. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had attained transcendent wisdom, the light of their wisdom able to illumine everywhere. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had perfected great vows, all pure. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had attained the lamp of knowledge, clearly illumining the teachings. 100 trillion enlightening beings illuminated by the light of truth of the Buddhas of the 10 directions. 100 trillion enlightening beings expounding the way to get rid of folly throughout the 10 directions. 100 trillion enlightening beings who entered the fields of all Buddhas. 100 trillion enlightening beings whose body of reality reached all Buddha lands. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had attained the voice of Buddhas and were capable of enlightening many. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had attained the means of producing all knowledge. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had accomplished all aspects of the teaching. 100 trillion enlightening beings who had attained true knowledge, like jewel banners, able to make plain all Buddha teachings. And 100 trillion enlightening beings able to fully reveal the realm of enlightenment. 100 trillion celestial kings of the various heavens prostrated themselves reverently. 100 trillion Raga kings gazed fixedly. 100 trillion Yaksha kings joined their palms above their heads. 100 trillion Gandharva kings developed pure minds of faith. 100 trillion Titan kings cut off their pride. 100 trillion Garuda kings held streamers in their mouths. 100 trillion Kinnara kings danced joyfully. 100 trillion Maharaja kings gazed with delight. 100 trillion world leaders bowed with respect. 100 trillion kings of the heavens of 33 celestial realms gazed unblinking. 100 trillion kings of the Suyama heavens joyfully sang praises. 100 trillion kings of Tushita heavens prostrated their bodies. 100 trillion kings of the heavens of enjoyment of emanations bowed their heads to the ground in respect. 100 trillion kings of the heavens of command of others emanations joined their palms reverently. 100 trillion kings of the Brahma heavens watched single-mindedly. 100 trillion celestial kings of great power reverently made offerings. 100 trillion enlightening beings sang eulogies aloud. 100 trillion goddesses single-mindedly made offerings. 100 trillion deities with the same aspirations danced with joy. 100 trillion deities who had lived in the same place in antiquity sang hymns of praise with beautiful voices. 100 trillion Brahma-body deities prostrated themselves in respect. 100 trillion Brahma-assistant deities joined their palms at their crowns. 100 trillion Brahma group deities circled around as guardian attendants. 100 trillion great Brahma deities sang eulogies of infinite virtues. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of light threw themselves on the ground. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of little light sang eulogies of the difficulty of meeting with an age when a Buddha is in the world. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of infinite light bowed to the Buddha from afar. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of light sound sang of the rarity of getting to see a Buddha. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of purity came here along with their mansions. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of minor purity bowed their heads with pure hearts. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of infinite purity descended, wishing to see the Buddha. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of universal purity approached with reverence and respect and made offerings. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of vastness reflected on past roots of goodness. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of minor vastness contemplated the rarity of the enlightened. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of infinite vastness, with sure respect, initiated all good actions. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of vast results bowed reverently. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of no troubles bowed respectfully, their faith firm and enduring. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of no heat joined their palms and remembranced the Buddha tirelessly. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of good sight bowed their heads to the ground. 100 trillion deities of the heavens of good manifestation meditated constantly on honoring and serving the Buddhas. 100 trillion deities of the heaven of the ultimate of form bowed reverently. 100 trillion deities of various heavens sang praises with great joy. 100 trillion deities each carefully considered and made adornments. 100 trillion enlightening deities guarded the Buddha's throne, ceaselessly embellishing it. 100 trillion flower-bearing enlightening beings showered all kinds of flowers. 100 trillion incense-bearing enlightening beings showered all kinds of fragrances. 100 trillion garland-bearing enlightening beings showered all kinds of garlands. 100 trillion enlightening beings bearing powdered incense showered all kinds of powdered incenses. 100 trillion perfume-bearing enlightening beings showered all kinds of perfumes. 100 trillion raiment-bearing enlightening beings showered all kinds of raiment. 100 trillion parasol-bearing enlightening beings showered all kinds of parasols. 100 trillion banner-bearing deities showered all kinds of banners. 100 trillion pennant-bearing enlightening beings showered all kinds of pennants. 100 trillion gem-bearing enlightening beings showered all kinds of jewels. 100 trillion ornament-bearing enlightening beings showered all kinds of ornaments. 100 trillion godlings came forth from their celestial palaces to the sight of the throne. 100 trillion godlings with pure faithful minds came with their palaces. 100 trillion nobly born godlings supported the throne with their bodies. 100 trillion consecrated godlings held the throne with their whole bodies. 100 trillion meditating enlightening beings contemplated respectfully. 100 trillion nobly born enlightening beings gave rise to purity of mind. 100 trillion enlightening beings became joyful and blissful in all senses. 100 trillion enlightening beings' profound minds of faith were purified. 100 trillion enlightening beings' faith and resolve were purified. 100 trillion enlightening beings' actions were purified. 100 trillion enlightening beings were enabled to take on birth freely. 100 trillion enlightening beings glowed with the light of truth. 100 trillion enlightening beings consummated the stages of enlightenment. 100 trillion enlightening beings became well able to teach and influence all sentient beings. Born of 100 trillion roots of goodness, protected by 100 trillion Buddhas, perfected by 100 trillion virtues, purified by 100 trillion sublime aspirations, beautified by 100 trillion great vows, produced by 100 trillion good actions, stabilized by 100 trillion virtuous qualities, made manifest by 100 trillion spiritual powers, developed by 100 trillion meritorious achievements, eulogized for 100 trillion praiseworthy qualities. As in the world the king of the Tushita Heaven reverently set up a throne like this for the enlightened one, so did the kings of the Tushita Heavens in all worlds likewise set up such thrones, with such adornments, with such ceremonies, with such faith, with such purity of mind, with such delight, with such joy, with such respect, with such appreciation of rarity, with such dancing, with such yearning, all were the same. Then the king of the Tushita Heaven, having set up the throne for the enlightened one, respectfully greeted the Buddha together with countless godlings of the Tushita Heaven. With pure hearts they showered clouds of flowers of innumerable colors, clouds of incenses of inconceivable colors, clouds of garlands of various colors, vast clouds of pure sandalwood, clouds of innumerable various parasols, clouds of fine celestial raiment, clouds of boundless beautiful jewels, clouds of celestial ornaments, clouds of innumerable incenses of all kinds, and clouds of all kinds of sandalwood and aloe. When the godlings each produced these clouds from their bodies, 100 trillion incalculable numbers of godlings of the Tushita Heaven, as well as the other godlings in the assembly, were overjoyed and bowed reverently. Countless goddesses danced with joyful anticipation, gazing at the enlightened one. In the Tushita Palace a host of unspeakably many enlightening beings hovered in the air, and with diligence and single-mindedness produced offerings surpassing all the heavens, and presented them to the Buddha, bowing respectfully, while countless forms of music played all at once. At this point, because of the great spiritual power of the Buddha, because of the effluence of past roots of goodness, and because of his inconceivable mystic powers, all the gods and goddesses in the Tushita Palace saw the Buddha from afar as though he were right before them. They all had the same thoughts. The appearance of an enlightened one in the world is rarely encountered. Now we are getting to see an omniscient one, who has unimpeded true awareness of all things. Thus thinking, thus observing, together with the other groups they all welcomed the Buddha, each heaping celestial robes with all kinds of flowers, fragrances, jewels, ornaments, heavenly sandalwood and aloe incense, celestial jewel incenses, flowers of all heavenly fragrances, and mandala flowers from all the heavens, and spread them as offerings to the Buddha. Hundreds of trillions of infinities of Tushita deities hovered in the air. All considering the Buddha the realm of wisdom and knowledge, they burnt all kinds of incenses, producing aromatic clouds, adorning the sky. Also, thinking of the Buddha with joy, they showered clouds of celestial flowers, adorning the sky. Also, thinking of the Buddha with respect, they showered clouds of celestial canopies, adorning the sky. Also, desirous of making offerings to the Buddha, they scattered clouds of all kinds of celestial garlands, adorning the sky. Also, engendering resolute faith in the Buddha, they cast countless nets of gold through the sky, with chimes of all kinds of jewels continuously producing beautiful tones. Also, considering the Buddha the supreme field of blessings, they adorned the sky with countless drapes and showered clouds of all kinds of jewelry endlessly. Also, conceiving profound faith in the Buddha, they adorned the sky with countless celestial mansions, playing all manner of celestial music, producing subtle, melodious tones. Also, considering how rare it is to meet a Buddha, they adorned the sky with clouds of celestial raiment of all kinds of colors, showering various incomparably beautiful robes. Also, their hearts leaping with boundless joy at the Buddha, they adorned the sky with countless celestial jewel crowns, raining countless celestial crowns forming great clouds. Also, conceiving great joy in regarding the Buddha, they adorned the sky with countless jewels of various colors, ceaselessly raining clouds of all kinds of jewelry. Hundreds of trillions of infinities of celestial beings, all conceiving pure faith in the Buddha, scattered countless heavenly flowers of various colors and burned various celestial incenses as offerings to the Buddha. Also, thinking of the Buddha as a magnificent miraculous appearance, they brought celestial sandalwood incenses of innumerable various colors and reverently scattered them before the Buddha. Also, their hearts leaping with joy in regarding the Buddha, they followed the Buddha holding countless precious celestial robes of various colors and spread them on the roads as offerings to the Buddha. Also, regarding the Buddha with purity of mind, they greeted the Buddha carrying countless banners of celestial jewels of various colors. Also, conceiving supreme joy at the thought of the Buddha, they brought countless celestial adornments of various colors to present to the Buddha. Also, engendering unbreakable faith in the Buddha, they brought countless garlands of celestial jewels to present to the Buddha. Also, incomparably joyful at the thought of the Buddha, they brought countless pennants of celestial jewels of various colors to offer to the Buddha. 100 trillion infinities of celestial beings, with tamed, tranquil minds free from indulgence, brought countless celestial musical instruments of various forms producing sublime tones to present to the Buddha. Continue to video 2.